Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This is the second one in the circulatory system series and it completes the study of this unit. In the first video, you've looked at the structure of the heart and how it fits into the overall circulatory system and how that system provides for all the cells of the body. Really, that looks at why the system exists. This is just the last bit of information really, looking at the three types of blood vessels that were mentioned in that first video, but this adds a lot more detail onto that. It's suitable for GCSE level. It's a continuation from the Circulatory System 1 video, as I've said. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so you can keep updated on any new videos that come out. So let's add a bit more detail to those blood vessels. Having now seen how the heart is all set up and that where those arteries come in and where the veins go out, let's just look at those two things in a bit more detail. So if I draw a cross section through them, so you have to imagine if I took the long tube of a blood vessel and I sliced it through and turned it end onto you, so you were looking at the circular end there. Let's build them both up. So first off, artery and vein. If I just put that on there, you'd go, oh, okay, vein's a lot bigger than an artery. But that's only the very innermost parts. That's the lumen. The lumen is just the hole. So if I held up my fingers like that, this hole, that's the lumen. The lumen is basically the hollow bit through any hole. So you've got the lumen where the blood will flow. And that red line is just representing the smooth lining of the arterial vein. It must be really, really smooth inside there so that blood cells don't get stuck on the walls and create clots. Okay. Outside of that, you have this layer. Now this layer is of muscle and elastic fibers. That gives it a huge amount of strength, but it means when the blood's pumped through hard, it can stretch a bit, it can recoil, but it makes them very, very strong. Okay. Outside of that, you've got a really, really tough wall. Okay. This is again, it's made of cells, but it's a really tough outer wall on the artery and vein. Now that you've got all four of those layers, compare the size of them again. You can see that arteries and veins are actually almost identical in size. The only difference is the comparative thicknesses of each of the layers that you've got in there. So let's just throw up a table now to try and make sure you've got all of that. In an artery, you've got a narrow lumen. It's a much smaller hole. That means blood's going to go through it much faster. If you think when you were little in the garden and you got the hose, if you put your thumb over the end of the hose, make it narrower, the water squirts much faster. Same with an artery. By being narrow, the blood can travel faster, so you're delivering everything more quickly. The vein can have a wider lumen. That means the blood's going to go slower through the veins. The artery has a very, very thick wall, because arteries come from the heart, where those ventricles have just given a massive push. So that blood's going to be at really high pressure being forced into those arteries. So those arteries need to have thick walls to withstand that pressure. Also a thick muscle and elastic layer to withstand that pressure, so they could stretch a bit but recoil back to their original shape. Veins just don't need that. So they have a thinner wall and a thinner muscle and elastic layer. It's not thin, the muscle and elastic layer, but it's thinner than what you'd find in an artery. And that's because, as I've just described, it's about the pressure. In an artery, you've got very high pressure because it's just come from that huge pump from the ventricles. In a vein, it's just slowly making its way back to the heart. So it's much lower pressure. Now, to add a couple of bonus bits of information there, because you're likely to be asked for differences between artery and veins. Arteries don't have any valves in them. We looked at valves in the heart, whereas veins do. The reason for that is because the blood going through an artery is traveling so fast and at such high pressure, it's just going to blast forwards anyway. But in a vein, because the blood's going slower, you need the valves to make sure nothing's going to flood backwards. So the veins have valves in them. They're called pocket valves. In an artery, you can feel a pulse because as the heart does its pulses from the ventricles, the blood literally flies along an artery. Then the next pulse it flies along, then the next pulse it flies along. Each time the heart beats, you're going to get a blast of blood moving along an artery. And if you try and measure your pulse, you can feel that as the blood blasts past your fingers. In a vein, because the blood's already spread out, it's given out its nutrients, it's taken in whatever toxins it needs, the blood's slowed right down. It's just a steady flow through veins. So you wouldn't feel a pulse in a vein. Now on the last slide, we also had capillaries, so let's add that on as well. And I'm going to give you the capillary now relative in size to the two that we've got there. And we've already said that capillaries are for the site of exchange. That's it. See that tiny little red circle? They're much, 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 much smaller. And even in this diagram, I've had to exaggerate it a bit just so you can see it. Capillaries are absolutely tiny. So what I'm going to do is just enlarge that picture just so we can see a bit of detail. And if you look at what I've done on that picture there, I've layered it, but hopefully you can see that I've made the walls 1 cell thick. Those blue blobs in there are the nuclei in each one of those cells. So that capillary you can see on mine is only 4 cells around and 1 cell thick. Okay, they're absolutely tiny, and the reason they're so tiny is because you need them to be the site of exchange, to give their nutrients out, to absorb stuff from the cells that the cells don't need. And you need that high level of exchange, that fast and efficient diffusion, to make sure that when the blood gets to its destination, it can give out its oxygen and its nutrients quickly, because very short distance to pass it through. It can pick up any wastes that it needs from those cells, and then it can be on its way again. Okay, so it's really important that capillaries are incredibly small. So let's just try and put all this information together now with one unifying diagram. If I've got this picture here, hopefully on here you can see I've got an artery over on that side. I've got the capillaries there in the middle, because one artery would branch and get smaller and smaller and smaller and branch out more and more and more until you get these tiny, tiny capillaries. And those capillaries would cover structures. Think back to how we saw the structures, the capillaries covering the alveoli in the respiratory system presentations. Those capillaries, once they've done all their exchange, so you can imagine blood coming from the heart going into that artery over there. Then that blood's going to go through all the capillaries where you've got exchange by diffusion. That stuff moving out of the blood to deliver it, but the blood absorbing any toxins as well, and then going back out through the vein. Okay, so you're going to have blood headed back to the heart to go that way. Of course, once it gets back to the heart, it can then go back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen, to then be sent round again to the intestines to pick up more nutrients, to go back to the heart, to be sent to the lungs again, to be sent somewhere else, and circulate round and round and round. Okay. Now, I mentioned the valves in the last slide. They're on this diagram, so I'm just adding it there for completeness. You can see a valve there in a vein. That's just making sure the blood flows in one direction, because when it went through all those capillaries, it would have slowed down so significantly that you now need valves to prevent any backflow of blood. Now remember, this loop happens twice. Once to the lungs, so you've got blood coming from the heart up to the lungs, spreading into those capillaries, covering the alveoli, coming back in the pulmonary vein to come back to the heart. And then a second loop going all around the body. Okay. Now remember, back to the heart diagram, technically when we say around the body, technically that kind of happens twice, because if I use my 2 fingers to try and represent the blood flow here, that first loop was up to the lungs and back, but then it's both around the upper and lower bodies and back. So it's lungs, body, okay? But it's still twice, because it's 1 loop to the lungs and once around the body. And because it's that double loop, it's called a double circulation or double circulatory system. So if you see that term anywhere, the double circulatory system, that's what we have. 1 circuit around the lungs, 1 circuit around the body. It's more efficient that way. So let's do a massive summary now, but we're going to do an exam style summary now to try and help you to build your answer, to help you develop better answering skills. So we're going to look at this step by step, and in each point I'm going to try and put a key piece of information for you until you could give a really good explanation as to what the circulatory system does and where the circulatory system goes. So let's put these 2 diagrams up here just to help you. This one above my head, the one that we've gone through, showing the loops, showing all the chambers of the heart. That one over there just showing the 2 circuits. The pulmonary circuit, I said pulmonary was everything to do with the lungs, and the systemic system, which is everything to do with your body's systems, okay, hence systemic, okay? So you've got those double circuits. There's a better diagram of the heart showing all the chambers. We're going to talk through all of that. So Let's start off in the vena cava. So I've just put a flashing cross up here so you can see my start point. So deoxygenated blood, 1 mark, enters the vena cava, 2nd mark, it's a key term. Then moves into the right atrium, key chamber, another mark, through a one-way valve into the right ventricle. We're up to 5 key points already, which contract to squeeze the blood up into the pulmonary artery. Contract could be worth a keyword in it, could be worth a mark in its own right, and pulmonary artery definitely would be. So we're now into 7. Taking blood to the lungs, where the artery splits into capillaries, so you now bring in the capillaries, to absorb oxygen by diffusion and give out carbon dioxide. 3 separate points in that one phrase, so we're up to 12 key points now. Before the capillaries rejoin to form the pulmonary vein, which takes oxygenated blood back to the heart. No, I haven't even mentioned about hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin. You could add those as extra details. We're still on 14 key points here, just in that very small amount of writing. And this is a key thing I want you to remember. You don't need to write loads in the exam to give brilliant answers. Just make sure what you do write is full of key terms. Okay, so we're on 14 so far. To the left atrium. So we're back at the heart now in the left atrium, 15 marks. Through a one-way valve into the left ventricle, which contracts to squeeze the blood up into the aorta. I'm going to give a mark to aorta, I'm not going to give a mark to contract again, but we're now up to 18. Which splits to take blood around the upper and lower body, so saying where it's going in the systemic system. Splitting capillaries to deliver nutrients, key mark, and pick up wastes, 21. Before heading back to the vena cava again to complete our cycle. I make that 22 key points that could be worth marks there. And that's not a lot of writing. If I asked you now, instead of taking a screenshot, to just write that out, what is it, a paragraph? A quarter of a page of A4? It's not much information to give a really detailed description of the circulatory system. And that's a skill you need to build. Conveying information with huge amounts of detail, but quickly, so you're not having to waste lots and lots of time in the exams. Either do write that out, it would be a good thing to do to help you to learn it, or take a screenshot for your notes. But that's a really great summary of the circulatory system. Okay, that marks the end of the physiology unit. So you should have watched the digestive system lessons, the introduction and the main physiology one of digestive system, the respiratory system ones and the mechanism of breathing, and now the circulatory system one. That covers all of the main, or the 3 main key physiological systems of the body. There are other systems you need to know about: renal system with the kidneys, endocrine system, nervous system, but these 3 are really, really fundamental and are a key part to your overall biological understanding. Please, if you've enjoyed this, do go and subscribe to my channel to keep updated on new lessons as they come out, and like this video if it was useful. Thank you.